Hello and welcome to 11FS Spotlight. My name is David Brear. In this show, we shine a bit of a spotlight on the best and the brightest in the tech and financial services industry to try and understand what is it that gets them going, growing, and what they really think the future of the industry will look like. On today's show, we wanted to shine that spotlight on somebody that we believe has had a really gigantic impact on financial services, but ironically has actually only spent a really small amount of time in the industry. Now, back in November 2022, we had our very first 11FS Awards, which included a special category, which was the 11FS Hall of Fame. Now, the idea was to celebrate people that we felt have had the biggest impact on the industry to make it better. These people all have made a big impact, giving back to the ecosystem or community. They've exhibited incredibly strong values of innovation, resilience, teamwork, and the boldness to launch product services that have fundamentally shaped the industry. Now, simply put, these people have brought us one step closer to the future of financial services. And one of those Hall of Famers is Sir Mark Walport, who I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by today. Sir Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure, thank you.
Now, not many people know this, but Sir Mark guided the UK financial services regulatory bodies on approaches that they could take and could be adopted from the healthcare industry and how to innovate without harming people. This was pretty instrumental in the UK's adoption of sandboxes and other progressive regulations that have now rippled out to Monetary Authority of Singapore, HKMA, the Fed, and many other regions around the world. There are very, very few people responsible for why this whole fintech thing really exists, and he is one of them. The world as financial services and the fabric of the fundamental industry is forever changed for the work that he did. So for anybody who, that's one hell of an introduction that I've done
yes,
to start with, right?
Surprising.
And I've made you blush slightly, haven't I, even on a cold
yes.
day. But for anybody who doesn't know your background, and I should say, and I said this to you before we started recording, your ears must start burning every 6 weeks or so when I'm talking to a senior person at a bank somewhere who's telling me, what you don't understand, David, is financial services are highly regulated and this is very, you can't do innovative things. So we're going to get to that in a second, but talk a little bit about your background.
Yes, well, fortunately, there's no scientific basis for burning ears. But my background is a million miles away from financial services, so I went to medical school originally. And the first half of my career, the sort of first 25 years really, was spent in medical research and delivering care to patients. So I was a general physician and a clinical rheumatologist, immunologist. But from school time, really, I'd been interested in research, and I knew that when I went to medical school, I wanted to be a medical researcher. And so I did that. But I got interested in sort of broader policy issues around medical research. And so via a somewhat tortuous route, in 2003, I found myself as the director of the Wellcome Trust. Very large biomedical scientific foundation whose mission was to foster and promote research with the aim of improving health. So, and it was there, funnily enough, that I had my first encounter with fintech in the broadest sense, because the Wellcome Trust funded a lot of research in Africa on malaria, on other tropical infectious diseases, also in Southeast Asia. And in visiting Kenya and units we had in Nairobi and on the coast at Kilifi, I learned about M-Pesa.
Yeah.
Which was an extraordinarily powerful brand then. Everywhere you went, you saw M-Pesa signs on the side of buildings of one sort or another. And that was an enormously empowering technology because basically it enabled people who had no bank accounts, no access to financial information, not only to transfer sums of money using mobile telephones, but also to get market information. So if they were a small subsistence farmer, they could learn what prices were reasonable to charge for their crops and not get ripped off by middlemen who would sort of take large profits and give them very little. So that was a powerful example of the power of financial technologies. And interestingly, that was actually partly funded by a grant from the UK government through overseas development assistance.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? And seeing that grow, everything Safaricom did, everything, M-Pesa, grew to be. I mean, the impact of that for Kenya, for Africa more broadly, in terms of the ripple out of that is really significant. And maybe if we come back to your sort of UK impact. Yeah. So, medical background is for our listeners.
Yes, shortly after I joined the Wellcome Trust, I was encouraged to apply for the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology, which advised the Prime Minister then, as it does now, on all areas of science and technology. And so I got sort of gradually involved in broader policy issues. And the Wellcome Trust did work with the government. For example, we helped to create the Francis Crick Institute at King's Cross, a huge, important medical research institute. And we co-funded it with Cancer Research UK and with the Medical Research Council, and brought in 3 London universities as well. And so after I'd done 10 years, the opportunity arose to move into Whitehall and become the government's chief scientific advisor. And although that definitely wasn't part of any career plan, it was quite an interesting midlife crisis, as it were. So that's what I did. And in 2013, I found myself inside government, as it were, working to advise the Prime Minister and the government on really all aspects of science, engineering, technology, and also the social sciences. That
must have been an amazing period of time. The change that was happening.
It was fantastic. And I suppose most of the work we did then was science and technology for government policy. And you could sort of divide it into different buckets. And a very important bucket was national resilience. Yeah. And so we did work on electricity capacity margins, for example, and all sorts of other areas of national resilience. And of course, we've seen the importance of that over the last few years with the COVID pandemic. Yeah. And my successor, Patrick Vallance, had to deal with that, which was quite a challenge.
I can imagine, yeah. Were you at home watching that on the TV thinking?
No, I wasn't. By that stage, I was the Chief Executive of UK Research and Innovation, and so involved in funding some of the research, and I was a member of SAGE, actually. But one of the other things we did, which is relevant to why we're sitting here now, is we used to do sort of short reports for government on emerging technologies, which could be important for how government operated, for the economy broadly, and might create issues around resilience and safety as well. So we looked at a whole series of areas of technology. So we did a report on the Internet of Things. And Fintech came up as it was clearly a rapidly developing area, an area where we might do a report. And so we assembled a group of experts and worked on it. And I suppose what happened was an example of interdisciplinarity, because it was perfectly clear that financial technologies had the potential to cause both good and harm. And this was an area I was very familiar with from the world of clinical medicine, where you don't release a new drug out into the general population until you've established that it's safe. Yes. And so why didn't we do that in other areas of science and engineering technology? And Fintech was a very obvious example. Why would you let an instrument of mass financial destruction out on the world without testing it?
Yeah. I mean, that's a very astute leap. I mean, lots of lateral industries can learn from each other in that sense. And as you say, obviously the medical industry is a little bit more rigorous when it comes to ABCD testing in that sense, in terms of bringing stuff to market. So, I mean, how open were people to those ideas? Because, like I was saying to you at the top of the show, CEOs of banks are often pretty. You don't get regulated industries. They're all quite predator. But the medical industry is obviously much more highly regulated than the financial services industry ever will need to be, because of really what's at stake, right?
Well, there's quite a lot of stake with financial instruments as well, actually. All right, I mean, they don't actually, you take them and you get some terrible side reaction and drop dead. But I mean, if you're ruined by a financial instrument, that's not great either.
It's a slower death, isn't it? Yeah,
yes. I think, we had a group of pretty entrepreneurial people developing the report. And actually, I think that it wasn't a hard sell, actually. It seemed fairly obvious that if one could create an environment which was a safe space to try out an emerging technology, in this case Fintech, that seemed a reasonably sensible thing to do. So we put it as one of the recommendations in the report, which primarily went to Treasury because that's their area of policy. And, it was one of those fortunate moments where a spark was lit, and they actually accepted the recommendation and spoke to the FCA. And the next thing was it was a sandbox environment where new technologies could be tried.
So who was the chancellor at that point then? Because to take that step and then make those recommendations into the regulator that's a big step, isn't it?
Yes, and the chancellor at the time was George Osborne, and actually he had a strong history of being very interested and supportive of science and technology. So we were lucky that there were ministers who were interested.
Yeah. And we had, this does feel like a trip down memory lane, but we had Mark Bailey over in the FCA, who's now obviously running the Bank of England. Yeah. We had various different people from the FCA side of things. But this idea of a sandbox, as you say, the rest being history to a certain degree, if you look out into the world of regulators globally, or even if you look out to how banks are operating now in terms of taking new features, taking new capabilities to market, this sandbox, this safe space, really has spread everywhere.
I think that's right. And it's quite interesting because it is, I think, just an example of an insight from another discipline. And because I think it does apply in a lot of areas. And so Patrick Vallance, who's just produced a report on emerging technologies, AI and others, has, again, suggested that it would be a good idea to have a sandbox environment where you can try out new things. And so it's quite a generally applicable model. And I think the other thing, which is also important, is to have sort of scale-up environments as well.
Yeah. So beyond the, hey, this has got some pace, but actually how do you expose it to broader audience?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And again, there is a precedent in the clinical world as well, which is that you start with trials in small numbers of people, but then before you absolutely let it out, you try the new product in thousands of people just to make sure that there aren't
anomalies,
aren't anomalies, which you won't pick up the rarest anomaly, but you'll pick up significant anomalies.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, you could never have known really with that recommendation how big of impact, because it's like if I talk to HKMA or MAS or SAMA, the FCA, every regulator has shifted how they're structured and actually how they regulate to a large degree, particularly new innovations, based on that work.
Yes, I think the FCA were very clever in the way they picked it up, and they've continued to evolve it as well, because initially they did it as annual cohorts, which was fine if you were in the cohort, but it did mean that you got one go a year, as it were, to get in. And now they've just opened it continuously, I think. But I don't think that there's a single model for each area, because each has its own peculiarities, and so a sandbox for autonomous vehicles, when you need roads and things like that, if you're going to do this initially, roads where there aren't other people, but later the roads where there are.
Yeah. Well, the FCA have done a lot of work in that space. As you say, the equivalent of pedestrians is having good, reliable data to really do things with. But I don't want to skip over this though. I mean, I love how blasé you are about the impact that you've had. But that must feel quite amazing, because actually there are no regulators on the planet that regulate in the way that they did prior to this report coming out.
Yes, it is quite surprising. But I suppose for every 1,000 recommendations, not everyone does strike home.
Sure.
And I think there is quite an important point underlying that, which is that when people want to change policy, they think that if you write a clever report and just drop it on a minister's desk, that something will happen. There's, I think, quite an important role in creating the customer, and so I think that was an important part, and if you like, the privilege of being the government chief scientific advisor, that you could actually socialise your report, the idea of the report, with the relevant government department before you did the work. So that, and then you would also work with the policymakers, the officials in the department, as the policy recommendations develop, and that increases the likelihood that they'll be accepted and have an impact. And the worst time of all to try and influence policy is after policy's just been made. So that after a policy's been announced, then it's jolly difficult to influence it. So the timing is everything, actually.
Yeah, and to that timing, obviously, I mean, the timing of these recommendations and the period of time we are in, obviously, just prior to 2008 or just post 2008, wasn't it? In terms of the changes and the need for a bit more stability. Obviously, the recession, the crisis that happened. I mean, it kind of feels like we're in a very similar time period now with a very odd climate and instability in financial services. So, I mean, from 2008 to today, we've seen just amazing innovations come out of the market because of that. Do you think this period of time, I know it's the weirdest silver lining to look at, but it kind of feels like there must be similar innovations.
Okay, so there is nothing like an emergency to stimulate innovation. And if you look at the history of innovation over actually a very long time, then sort of war and catastrophe has been a very powerful stimulus. In medicine, things like blood transfusion, trauma surgery, enormous amount came out of war, actually.
Yeah. Necessity, right? Patch people up.
Absolutely. Well, and you have to do it urgently. And so in COVID, there's no question that we got RNA vaccines many years faster than we would have got them if they'd just been developed at the pace that people were used to, because it was a life and death issue to get the vaccines as quickly as possible. But that didn't obviate the need to make sure that they were safe before they were used.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting.
So you can do proper, rigorous studies even in an emergency. And actually the UK was rather good at that in COVID, because if you look at the recovery trial, which was a clinical trial conducted in the NHS trying a whole variety of drugs that were used for other conditions, they were done at such scale and rigor that they were able to show that, for example, a relatively cheap steroid drug proved life-saving in significant numbers of people who had the most severe variants of the disease, and equally that hydroxychloroquine, beloved of a certain American president at the time, had no effect at all. In fact, it was harmful, probably. Yeah. So just because it's an emergency doesn't obviate the need to introduce things carefully.
Yeah.
But I think there's another issue as well, which is the whole question of resilience. National resilience and global resilience. And the whole area of money is one where there is the potential for terrible harm to occur. And so we saw the instability around 2008. We see the instability at the moment. And so we did a report on distributed ledgers, and that was looking far beyond Bitcoin, actually. It was looking at the potential for distributed ledgers to establish, the provenance and the authenticity of things, and smart contracts, all the things that I think probably still haven't been properly exploited, because there's all this focus on cryptocurrency. But money's funny stuff, and if the world system goes wrong on that, we're in trouble.
Yeah, and it's a funny one, isn't it? In the way that we saw with hyper-connected, global setup, we saw the COVID spread so quickly. The financial systems are probably more precariously placed because of the hyper-connectivity of the world in that way as well.
Well, that's quite true. When things go badly wrong, things that you think are uncorrelated become correlated.
Yeah.
And so you see financial contagion spreading around the world at, literally the speed of an electron traveling around the world, as it were. So
whether it's a cough, a sneeze, or a tweet from somebody with regards to Silicon Valley Bank, then it all spreads really quickly, doesn't it?
Yes, and so, I think one of the challenges for society is as it becomes more efficient, it potentially becomes much less resilient. And so we rely on just-in-time supply lines. In the banking world, high-speed trading, which was something that my predecessor, John Beddington, did work on. You see people, trying to locate their servers, as close to the exchange in order to arbitrage, tiny differences. Yeah. It's just because it can be done doesn't necessarily mean it should be done.
Yeah. I think that's a Jurassic Park quote as well, isn't it? I never thought Sir Mark Walport would give me a Jurassic Park quote on the Fintech Insider podcast, but I'm happy with that one. Just before we wrap up then, massive thank you for everything that you've done for the industry. It's weird for me I'm not speaking on behalf of him, but I'm not sure we would have a business in the way that we have a business without people like you doing what you've done, and that's absolutely amazing. I guess coming towards the end of the show, talking a little bit about well, we're seeing this change, we're seeing opportunities in the market, banks are seeing opportunities, fintechs are seeing opportunities. What would you encourage them to do more of? Because I guess the thesis of what you were looking at was experimentation, wasn't it? It was about safely experimenting to move us forward.
Yes. So, I mean, I think the first thing is that, I mean, it comes back to the motivation of what type of product are you going to try to make. And I mean, I suppose, you know, it's a lot of capitalism is about making money, but I mean, these are products that I think it's about thinking through the implications of, you know, it's easy to think about the upsides of products, but I think it's quite important to think about the potential harms as well. Unforeseen side effects by their nature are unforeseen, but some of them could have been foreseen. And I suppose my philosophy has always been that if you can possibly collect rigorous evidence, it's better to do the experiment in advance, if you possibly can, rather than just let something out that then causes harm. And we are at a very, very interesting time with AI starting to come into its own. And this is a very obvious space where you might want to do things in sandboxes.
Yeah, definitely. And the ability, I guess, at that stage to test and to learn, you know, exponentially quicker in terms of, you know, assimilating and ingesting data. You know, our opportunities to do this is much greater than it's ever been, isn't it?
Yes, and there's both, I think, a responsibility to use data, but I think that there is equally a responsibility to use the data in a way that doesn't cause harm.
Sure, I agree.
And there's a great deal of, and so, again, doing this all in safe environments, I think, is really important, actually.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us, everybody. Make sure that you follow 11FS on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and stay up to date with all the cool stuff that we'll be doing. And if you enjoyed this show, do make sure you subscribe to the 11FS YouTube channel, where you can also catch all of the previous episodes as well. Have a great week, everybody. Goodbye.